Body. While we're being set up technically, let us start. Among other things, because there is, I understand, there are various people may wish to participate just around the time this event ends. So we'll try to end very punctually, maybe a few minutes early. Welcome. My name's Jonathan Woolley, and I'm the director of the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva. This event is Trust and Peacebuilding Approaches for Ambitious Climate Action, and it's brought to you by the World Council of Churches, by the Quaker United Nations office, by Brahma, Kumaris, and by Quaker Earth Care Witness. And the Friends World Committee for Consultation that you may have seen on the screen is the umbrella body of Quakers, and that's why that's mentioned. Thank you very much for being here on this last day, almost last day. We know it's been a long session. Without pressuring you, we'd certainly like to invite you to come towards the front if you wish. We'll be having a discussion later, and that will just make it easier. We're having this event because ambitious climate action, as I'm sure we all know, is needed now. But climate action just isn't just about technical solutions. It's about our ability to work together as humanity, using our human skills as individuals and as society. And I think everybody here at the table, I'm sure many of you, believe that humankind can respond to big challenges. There are many examples of that in history. We can respond working with trust and with peace together. And this side event is about exploring that further. We'll hear from our panelists, and then we want to open up a discussion with everybody here to explore this further together. I won't put more into words except to say, just to tell you that we are actually being webcast on the UNFCCC site. This means sound and images from the presenters, but not images of you personally. But what you say will be transmitted to those who are listening in different parts of the world. We hope that inspires you rather than inhibits you. With that, may I go to our first speaker, who is Sonja Klinsky, who's an associate professor at Arizona State University, and she's going to open up a particularly interesting aspect of this for us. Thank you, Sonja. From there or from here? Well, from there, if you like.
Up there. I may as well just move around a little bit. We all do enough sitting in our lives. We may as well take the opportunity to stand up. I'm Sonja, and Jonathan, would you give me a wave when I have 1 minute left? We're trying to be super quick today. I want to speak to you about a somewhat unusual project I've been running for a year. I've been working on justice and equity in the climate space for over a decade. And about a year and a half ago, I realized with the Paris Agreement that far from dealing with the justice issues, the Paris Agreement temporarily sidelined the deepest justice issues. And that actually, not only could these get worse over time, but the Paris Agreement doesn't give us a great foundation in some ways. So what are these justice issues, and what's the way forward that I'm thinking of that's a little bit different? So the justice issues I'm concerned about are the vast disparity of historical responsibility we face, the enormous range of basic human development that every country faces, both across countries and within, and of course, climate impacts. And all of these three different elements of injustices intersect in dynamic and probably usually pretty terrible ways. So the justice elements of climate change are a fundamental element of climate. And if we ignore them, I think we do so at our peril. Now, why do I think that in fact justice tensions are not gone away, but actually could increase? Two main reasons. We all know that we are far from where we need to be on climate mitigation, and impacts are going to get much more severe. At the same time, no one party or even one group of parties can have sufficient mitigation to actually stop the problem. which means that there's going to be increased pressure for many places, countries, communities to increase their mitigation commitments even more. And I think both of these are going to actually increase our tensions around justice and inequities rather than decrease them over time. And this made me realize that the Paris Agreement's only really in the process of being solidified, which gave us an enormous opportunity to think more creatively about what does it mean to create solidarity. There's been all kinds of conversation about the Paris Agreement is universal. It places a framework for solidarity, but I think we have failed to learn from the past experiences about how do you actually create solidarity? How do you actually try to create systems of reconciliation? So for the past year, I've been thinking about how unique, or in my case, not unique, the climate system is. And I realized that as a climate community, we've been so busy talking to each other that we've completely forgotten hundreds of years of peace work, but more specifically, the issue of transitional justice, which has grown since the 1940s, so that over 60 countries in the world have had to deal with some kind of profound transition, where there's been unavoidable historical responsibilities and injustices, and the desire to coexist in a better future. So for over a year, we've been running international workshops with peace scholars, transitional justice scholars, and climate people to find out what could we learn from all these experiences which have been systematically excluded from the climate space. Now, why do I think this is useful? Well, this is why climate isn't unique and why we ought to be learning lessons from these other systems. One, we have a system of interdependence. If we don't create more collective action, if we don't create some sort of solidarity, we're all going to suffer, which is exactly the same situation you see in many of these conflicts. You have a limited ability of the judicial system. Many of the harms we're talking about do not fit our legal systems very well, especially systemic ones. This is exactly what you see in many of the transitional justice situations where they've used law in some spaces, but the entirety of the injustice does not fit within the justice system. You have this idea that you have a huge disagreement between how we ought to think about the past. How much ought past harms indicate future obligations? An enormous division here between countries who think we ought to just say, oh, the past is the past, let's just move on. And countries who say, no, 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 the past is central to our identity and central to climate justice. Those are two very different ideas about how we deal with the past, which is identical, again, to many of these conflicts. It's completely unclear in the climate space how to deal with profound loss. Anyone who's looked at loss and damage seriously knows it isn't just about financial compensation, because you can't compensate the loss of culture, and you can't compensate the loss of lives, and you can't compensate for our profound loss of trust with each other, which is one of the key things that happens when you have conflict and when you have deep loss. Again, this is exactly why people have looked in transitional justice processes at many other forms of repair that go beyond material monetary compensation. So while we need material support, we also need to be thinking much more broadly about these losses and how to deal with them. At the same time, transitional justice, as many of you know, is a deeply political, imperfect process. Well, does that sound familiar to anyone? I would challenge anyone in this space to argue that the climate space is a fair playing field, or that politics haven't systematically impeded our ability to do anything in this space. Transitional justice comes with it a tradition of having to navigate injustice and poor politics. So with that, is that my 1 minute or is that my end? It's my 1 minute. Great. So we've learned a lot. We've had a year of workshops. We've learned some really important lessons. I'm not going to get into details, but here are the takeaways. One, acknowledging responsibility for past actions is actually a key part of being able to move forward. If you completely ignore the past, you are undermining the future. Actors with historical responsibility will try to manipulate anything they can in the political space, which you need to think about how to protect them, how to deal with concerns about retribution, and create some space for them to be able to operate. Because if you make it so tight for them, they actually will lash out and be uncooperative. This idea of legitimacy in the long term only survives if you have included the voices of those who've been most impacted at the very beginning of the design. And it's not one thing. There's not a single transitional justice system that's been successful that relied on one mechanism, because the nature of harms are so diverse that redress looks different. So we looked at a variety of mechanisms. We looked at amnesties, litigation strategies, truth commissions, civil society engagement, a huge range of different forms of reparations, and a huge range of institutional reforms. I don't have time to tell you what we learned from each of these, which is why you ought to go to our website and either email me directly or download all of our documents. I have one last printed document that has a policy brief for each of those areas, and I'm happy to share them digitally with anyone who contacts me. So with that, I wish you a good day. And I hope I stayed in my time.
Thank you, Sonja. Not only did you observe the time, but you got us to a splendid start. I hope that has some ideas bubbling in the room. Now it's my pleasure to ask the next speaker to give her contribution. I'll introduce Joy Kennedy, who's from the World Council of Churches Climate Change Working Group. Joy.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome everybody. Glad to see people coming out on the last day of the COP. Gosh, we're here. I want to talk to you about, I don't know where my PowerPoint is. It must be there somewhere. I want to make a frame around something that we haven't named. We have been naming climate justice, and it's come really day was the first time observed at the UN yesterday. It was exciting. But we need to also be talking about climate peace. And so I'm claiming it, you know, you can quote me. I'm talking about climate peace. Because in order to create a climate for change, we believe in the faith communities that the greatest untapped natural resource for addressing the world's most pressing problems is the energy of religiously committed people. And those people are often talking about peace, you know, world peace. Okay, so, well, something happened and it didn't. Okay, oh, okay. Making peace with the earth. They say peace, peace, when there is no peace. So ancient texts, which most religious organizations have as their foundational doctrines or understandings, they warn of false proclamations of peace by those who would manipulate the situation and hide the truth. And those people are warned that they will be scorned. Mother Earth can't be fooled, though. So how then do we realize true peace? And how do we get there? In the streets, we scream, yell, shout, no justice, no peace, no justice, no peace. And while we seek peace and speak peace and preach peace and teach peace, we treat for peace and pray for peace. But without acting for justice and building for peace, there can be no lasting just peace. We have just war doctrines. What about just peace? The International Ecumenical Peace Convocation, which was the culmination of a decade to overcome violence from the World Council of Churches, declared that just peace must include peace among the peoples, peace in the community, peace in the marketplace, and peace with the earth. So, climate peace. Peace with the earth requires climate peace. Climate peace requires climate justice. Climate justice includes equity, and equity includes human rights for all. That's the framework that we think about our action in, and that motivates us. So in the World Council of Churches, we published this book of action called Making Peace with the Earth. Surprise. But action and advocacy for climate justice. And this includes actions by faith communities all around the world to limit their own contributions to climate change, but to also educate and advocate for climate justice. It includes things like spiritual practices, which we think is their métier, their raison d'être, to have spiritual practices of many kinds. How to deal with material, buildings and properties, and Also climate engagement in the community and at international levels. Environmental action, real action, and the whole developing trend of divest and reinvest, which at this point in time seems like a no-brainer. Why would you continue to invest in fossil fuels? Let's invest in renewables, for example. So we have many guiding principles, but one of the most important ones is solidarity. It's about trust building, but with whom? Solidarity actions need to be seen as responsive accompaniment, not an imposed, here's where we're going, friends, but a responsive accompaniment with victims of climate change, with displaced peoples and climate refugees, with women and children and the most vulnerable, with advocates for climate justice, joining together, particularly at this moment in time with Indigenous peoples and with those on the front lines of climate resistance. So I want to talk about and show you some pictures from Solidarity with Standing Rock. This is an anti-pipelines for oil and gas across Indigenous waters and lands. But importantly, it's an abrogation of peace treaties, so-called peace treaties that were signed hundreds of years ago, but which have been broken. It's about the violation of human rights, the non-compliance with UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the non-implementation of free, prior, and informed consent, that important principle in the UNDRIP. So a call went out from Standing Rock to leaders of religious and faith communities. And so answering to them to come and stand beside the people who were protesting and standing in Standing Rock, North Dakota. And they came. Over 500 religious leaders, mostly from North America, Canada, US, but other places as well. And they came and stood with and prayed with and sang with the Lakota Dakota people. And they stood in front of the military and the police who were trying to prevent them from exhibiting their solidarity. Students from seminaries, young people from all over were there, and hundreds came and are still there. There were also solidarity marches in many places, and I was in the one in Toronto a week ago Saturday, which was thousands of people coming out to the US Embassy or consulate and to the City Hall saying we must stand in solidarity with Standing Rock. There were many religious groups, but I loved these two young Muslim women who had Muslims for Solidarity with Standing Rock. At Standing Rock, they burnt the doctrine of discovery. This elder burned this repudiated doctrine because doctrines and policies matter, good ones and bad ones. They affect human rights and our whole society. Climate peace, therefore, must include things like repudiation of old bad notions and policies, but it includes these things of decarbonization, 100% renewables, clean tech, clean finance, just transition, sustainable communities, equity and justice, solidarity actions, hope, prayer, and love, most importantly. What is the moral imperative? That's the question we always ask ourselves. What is the moral imperative? What must I do? What must we collectively do? Well, as President Hilda Hein from the Marshall Islands said the other day at a side event, there is no justice, prosperity, or peace on a planet that's on fire. Let us choose to make peace with the earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy. Our next speaker is Lindsey Fielder-Cook. Lindsey is the representative on climate change at the Quaker United Nations office. Lindsey.
First, forgiveness. I'm trying to do this without a PowerPoint, but that means I'm more reliant on reading. This is an experiment for me. These are extraordinary times, and the need of us to be a little less ordinary, a little less afraid, and a little more courageous, because the lives of vulnerable communities now and all our future generations are at stake. All of us in this room know that greenhouse gas emissions are on track in this century to warm the climate some 4.8 centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and that is a devastation to our Earth. This does not have to happen, but we do not have much time. In the climate negotiations, delegates identify themselves with country names, but the real presence in the chair, nature, does not negotiate. We are here to engage in trust and peace-building approaches for more ambitious climate action, subjects that are critically linked. Today, I want to begin with an example of trust. I want to move on to rights-based approaches, and then I will link this to peace-building. My example of trust is through Kuno's quiet diplomacy here at the climate negotiations, but it is really only a half story. Since 2013, we have offered diverse groups of countries a safe listening space during negotiations to help build communication and understanding. This entails off-the-record dinners for up to 20 delegates, reflecting all negotiating groups in the room. And establishing this work was not easy, but what drove me and still drives me is in an awareness that in many ways, I and many of these people in this room here today are more free than the delegates out in those negotiating rooms. And while they are held to country positions, these people in those negotiating rooms, they know the science better than most of their ministers. They probably, well, I know, they often struggle with the dysfunction of the process and the likely insufficient level of their pledges. They see climate effects in their countries, and they probably fear for their children's futures. And my question was, how do you hold that in yourself emotionally and intellectually? There's a grief there. And the quiet diplomacy is a space to encourage people to speak more openly because it's off the record, but to speak about the challenges that they personally are experiencing, to explore how their national interests are potentially global interests, and we ask them to speak for humanity. But this is a half story because we alone, the quiet diplomacy we do, that does not build trust. It's a step towards trust, but trust comes through people themselves and it comes through their actions. So how do we build the trust and peaceful approaches? This is what I'm going to talk about in terms of a rights-based approach. And I'm going to explain it really simply because when I went to graduate school, and then before that having worked in conflict zones, I had no idea what a rights-based approach was until I joined Kuno. In technical discussions in these negotiations, I have personally found human rights language to very powerfully articulate what is at stake: the right to life, health, food, water, adequate housing, and self-determination, the basics. The inclusion of human rights language for me clarifies what must be respected and protected, and a rights-based approach refers to when we work meaningfully in incorporating human rights in climate policies and actions. And my message today is why a rights-based approach in climate action can lead to more ambitious climate action. In some, because citizens whose lives are affected by climate change policy are more likely to support climate action when their rights are protected, promoted, and respected. It's a virtuous cycle, and it is a direct channel for strengthening public support in climate action. But trust, let's also talk about fears. The fears that human rights language integration leads to litigation, and this does happen. But that path is the last event. That is when all else fails. And it is usually the result of the absence of a rights-based approach that leads to litigation, in turn, the rejection of climate policy by a community, which in turn would delay climate action. For this reason, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment states that a rights-based approach promotes policy coherence, legitimacy, and sustainable outcomes. Sustainable means enduring, and enduring means more ambitious climate action. And finally, peace building. I came to climate change not because I was a scientist or an environmentalist, and I can't even garden happily. I came to this work because I saw climate change as a peace concern. I have lived in failed states. I can see where rising temperatures could bring all of our countries. And increasingly, we hear how climate change feeds conflicts, will lead to war. When the new US president takes office, it is possibly that the only US department that's going to honestly engage in climate change will remain, and I say remain, the Pentagon. They were the first to even engage with this. And while the language of fear can raise awareness in climate change, fear is more likely to create panic rather than empowerment. Rising temperatures create great stresses on the planet's limited natural resources, and these stresses do and can lead to conflict. The question is, how can we ensure that they don't turn violent? How can we prevent a violent conflict? The first answer, the blunt answer, is urgent mitigation. At a certain level of temperature increase, we cannot rely on adaptation or peace-building approaches. But the second, alongside urgent mitigation and decarbonization, is peace-building approaches in communities, those who are struggling with this kind of environmental deterioration. And these approaches, which CUNO works on, include methods like locally led conflict analysis, creation of dialogue between groups with competing interests, and empowerment of vulnerable groups to articulate their needs. These approaches, they help individuals and communities to understand and deal with the resource conflict and the underlying tensions made worse by the impact of rising temperatures. And the peace-building methods can also ensure that legal solutions are sustainable and do not lead to destructive conflict. In a world where equitable sharing of natural resources is regularly thwarted by power and money imbalances, peace-building approaches are strengthened by what we call procedural obligations of states in environmental decisions. Procedural obligations include states' duties to assess environmental impacts and make environmental information public, to facilitate public participation in environmental decision-making, and to provide remedies to address and access on the harm. In the experience of my CUNO peacebuilding colleagues, using these procedures helps to empower disadvantaged groups and helps to promote inclusive decision-making about natural resource management. Enabling communities to participate in the design and the implementation of projects can avoid injustices that frustrate long-term success. Just briefly, those of you who have, for example, lived in Denmark and seen the wind turbines versus those who might live in the UK and see the difference, there's an inclusion of community in those approaches, and that makes a difference. And look at the difference in what that's doing to their grid. So finally, the root causes of anthropogenic climate change, and I do not need to tell this audience, I'm sure, they lie in our human behavior. We are the problem, as my friend Ben said the other night, we are the problem, but we are also the solution. And we cannot and should not think that this solely can be done through technical fixes. We need a transformation of the human behaviors which are the root causes. When policies and regulations made by governments are right-based, they are more supported by their citizens. And for this reason, holistic inclusion of human rights in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, for parties to respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, to quote the preamble, is critical for reaching sufficient, fair, effective, and therefore ambitious mitigation and adaptation to protect all species, including us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsey. Our next speaker is Henrik Grape, the Officer on Sustainable Development of the Church of Sweden. Henrik.
Thank you. I'm also the coordinator of World Council of Churches Climate Change Group, Working Group on Climate Change, sorry. Yeah, I just have 3 slides for you to sort of contemplate on. I'm the first speaker with not English as my mother tongue, so it's a bit harder for me to just improvise. And I think that what we have heard here is so very on spot and so very important. Mechanism, how to use this transitional justice, the activities that Joy told us about, and Lindsey with a very good presentation on the issues. So I will be the loose guy and trying to sort of think of this out from a more spiritual perspective. This picture is from 2008, and I see Father Brinkman here, who was one of the signatories of the Uppsala Interfaith Climate Manifesto, and we made this Uppsala Interfaith Climate Summit. That was a kind of experiment, that a new journey that we started. We have been working with climate change in Church of Sweden, together with World Council of Churches, together with Action by Churches together with Lutheran World Federations for some years. But we also see the importance to have this as a faith communities from all faiths together, because this issue on the challenge of climate change is at those levels that we cannot sort of brand ourselves as different religions. We people of faith have something important to contribute. World Council of Churches has been involved in climate issues since the COP started. And the message has been that the climate change is more than politics and technical solutions, just as we heard from the introduction. It is more than a question of environment. I think it's about moral duty to act, and it's about our understanding of what it's to be a human on this earth. And it's a matter of justice between rich and poor of the world. As a communion of faith, we have a language of praying, and we pray in different ways. And I take this picture as a good picture of how we can actually also pray together, even if we have different kind of way of doing it and thinking of what it is. And praying might seem like a very passive way and a low effect of changing the very urgent, serious situation that we are in today. And of course, that is right. Praying doesn't change the impact of climate change, but praying is a way to articulate what is of utmost interest, our ultimate concerns, and it's also about a way of focusing on what to act on. In all faiths, we are praying, but praying doesn't always mean words. It is a way of living. And I think that this is a spiritual way of acting and thinking that paves the way for the change that the world is so great need of. There are many voices of saying that we need a transformation of our societies, our economies, and of our lifestyles. To reflect on what a good life is and how we can change is a part of our identities as people of faith. But it's also important to stress that faith cannot be of instrumental value for political change, but faith communities often have as their core and their identity a way of understanding what makes life meaningful, and that could add to the process of reaching a more just and peaceful world. And I tend to say that the core of most of faith communities, I would say almost formulated as love, as Joy said, as one of the important things. What is love in the deepest sense? I think that our theoretical and theological standpoints points back on our own actions. If we should be credible as a faith community, we need to let our theological reflections push us to act. I think it's not very comfortable to pray for one thing and act the other way. I will change the slide. Look, this is a slide when we actually have a water ceremony in the northern Sweden. It was indigenous people from the Nordic countries, from Canada and Alaska, and we had a water ceremony. Actually, we went to this meeting together. Everybody brought their own bottle of water from their home, and we poured it into a bowl together, say some words about it, and when we ended the conference, Bishop Mark MacDonald with the ponytail, he said, we had a ceremony and we pour our common water back to the river again. And this was a very powerful message, I would say. It was a very powerful way of sort of strengthen our work for climate change, for combat of climate change, for climate justice, to do this kind of ceremonial way of praying and acting, and actually Joy with the camera, you see, with the hat on. I think we need to make a real change to avoid a future that will be hard for coming generations to deal with. We need the innovations, we need the political decisions, that's why we're here, but we also need a vision and long-term aspirations. And faith not only could, I think they should play a central part when it comes to bringing the people of the earth together in a common vision that will last and helps us to bring the transformation of the earth that the earth so desperately need. Justice and equity is a part of our spiritual vision that faith communities can bring. And faith communities can also bring hope. Hope is something else than just prognosis. The origin of hope, I think, is transcendent. A people of faith are a people of hope. And hope is the first step to walk the path of transformation. And some of you heard it before, but I say it again. I used a quote from Saint Augustine, who once always said, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their name are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they don't remain the way they are." I think that faith can be the carrier of hope and its beautiful daughters. Anger over the inequalities and the greed that destroys the earth and the possibilities for future generations, and courage to start the transformation needed for a more just and equitable world. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik. Before we enter discussion, we have one more speaker whom we're looking forward to hearing. Valerian Bernard is from the Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual University. Valerian. We have to, no, we can't move that.
Good afternoon, and a salute of peace to all my brothers and sisters here present. My friends here, I think, have said many things that I really fully agree with. I will just remember just now with you a few words that for me is so essential to remember. Responsibility, solidarity, love, justice, peace, hope, human rights. I think that these are the values that are actually the bedrock of a possible change in the way we want the world to move forward. The present climate crisis is an illustration of the state of nature and of our human civilization, and also of its values. Somehow, we still don't fully realize the importance of the ethical aspects in our human life and its impact on the planet, especially when it comes to trust, justice, and peace. It is our duty to examine the spiritual principles that are essential to the respective life of each person, of each plant, of each community, and of their environment, considering their impacts on nature and our lifestyle and the values that support them can contribute to restore a harmonious life and equilibrium in our environment. The vulnerability of matter reflects, for me, the imbalance we have created by breaking the biodiversity chains of the oceans, in the air, and on the earth. It is therefore our duty to look closely at the different laws, values, and principles. And when I'm saying laws, I also mean spiritual laws that we have to reverse. The rules in our universe are actually embedded on different spiritual laws. The law of love, for instance. So if we are not aligned in the way we are being, then the impact we have on others in the different agenda, the harmony is scattered. Some fundamental principle is broken. The balance, the trust, the love become distorted in our lives and in our human family. This is a very subtle balance, and many cannot, will not see it because they don't recognize its deepest roots. Only when we are confronted with deep injustice can we appreciate the importance and the fragility of justice, tolerance, and humanity. Therefore, the key is to make sure that spiritual laws are aligned with natural laws. Article 1 of the Human Rights Charter states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And I don't know if you remember the story of Abel and Cain. When God met Cain, what did he ask him? Where is your brother? Before he showed him the consequences of his act. So what are we doing to our brothers? And again, the beautiful ways my friends here are trying to look at that. So we can see the effect of these crises on the values that we have today. Peace in the world starts with a sense of peace within. And it's only when we are the embodiment of that peace that we can share it around us, that we can create step by step and be peace messenger communities through cooperation and dialogue. And I think that the whole Copenhagen crisis showed us what happens when the break in trust was created amongst the different countries. So the world needs to transform coercive forces, restlessness, selfishness, greed, and short-term vision into an inner understanding and into an inner experience of the core values that would give us strength and power. And like this, we could apply in our awareness and in our vision and our attitude and our behaviors, whether this is individually or whether it is at the way of our intention in business, in the communities, in the politics, here at the climate change conversation. Because we really need to help others be empowered by being empowered ourselves. And so for me, the deep need is for a different lifestyle so that we stop taking so much from Mother Nature, leave it in the ground. And in that way, that can only be motivated by a deep change of intentions from our heart. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valeriane. Thank you to all those who have spoken. 2 technical comments. First, the PowerPoints are available on the web page for this side event. And second, there are a number of publications available on the table outside related to some of what you've heard. It's always dangerous at this point for the moderator to try and put his or her own interpretation. So may I just pick up a few words that resonated with me? I think we've heard from many of those who've spoken of climate change as a peace and justice issue. The different speakers have in some cases spoken from their own particular faith background, but as we enter the discussion, I'd like to invite everybody, whatever your faith, or if you have no particular recognized spiritual tradition, but the call here has been very clear that we all, from an ethical point, need to act as members of humanity, and that individual actions are needed as well as multilateral agreements. We've heard about the role of transitional justice. We've heard that there's no climate peace without climate justice. We've heard how quiet diplomacy among people here in this setting can make a difference. And we've seen examples of how different faiths in the world can come together to remind those who adhere to those faiths that this is very much an ethical issue and we can make a difference. With that, may I do two things. First, invite anybody who wishes to come forward so we really make this more of a discussion circle. It's not an obligation. And second, to ask you please to make any comments, to ask questions of those who've spoken, to take this conversation further. We're in your hands, but we very much invite you to contribute. And there should be a roving microphone. I see there is. Thank you. Who would like to say something, please? And of course, as usual, please do introduce yourself and please try to be relatively brief so that others may have a chance.
My apologies for sitting toward the back. I came in a little bit late. Get your reaction to an idea. I'm Greg Walker, by the way, from Mediators Beyond Borders. And yesterday I attended a Momentum for Change event on ICT, Information and Communication Technologies, ICT solutions. And as you know, Momentum for Change is a relatively new initiative coming out of the Secretariat. And there are three areas: women for results, financing for climate-friendly investment, and ICT solutions. Let me get your reactions to an idea that perhaps a group of us proposed to the Secretariat a fourth area: Momentum for Change about peace and justice. Just some thoughts. Get your thoughts on that.
Thank you. That sounds like a great start to the continuing discussion. Who else would like to contribute? Friend here.
Hi, my name is Matt Luna. I'm from the Institute for Environmental Security based in The Hague. First of all, I'd like to thank you for what you're doing here. The world needs a lot more of it. Secondly, I'd like to introduce something that we've been working on, and I've heard some key words in here: dialogue, cooperation. It's a publication called Climate Change and Security in South Asia, Cooperating for Peace. One of the big moments for me in this briefing is the authors are from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan working together. These are retired general level officers, and they've come together with the military being involved. A lot of people, when they hear military and climate, they're like, what? But this looks more like transboundary water cooperation, humanitarian disaster response, and cooperating like that. So this is also related to a conference that is going on next month in The Hague, the Planetary Security Conference. It's going to be at the Peace Palace. So that's on the internet, Planetary Security Initiative. So I have some copies of these that I'll put on the table. And if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to talk to them. Thank you.
Two different contributions here in the front, please.
Hi, my name is Kat Boyle. I am from the Unitarian Universalist Association. And I just want to reflect on, I think it's Valerina, that we are in such a fragile ecosystem together. One of the main principles of Unitarian Universalism is that we are all connected in this interdependent web of life. And I just want to extend the gratitude from my heart, knowing that there are siblings in the faith community all over the world that are working together in this extreme issue of justice and peace. So thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Kira Shannon with Green Faith. I just want to visualize Lady Justice. So she has a blindfold, she has a sword, and she also has a balance. I think one of the greatest contributions that the faith community is serving is to talk about, the vulnerability of communities most at risk. I think in terms of a just transition, we also need to think about the vulnerability of those who also rely on fossil fuels for their livelihood. And I think that it is the faith community that has to listen to both sides. So Lindsey also spoke about the engagement side of things. Joy, I think you mentioned more about the Dakota pipelines and the protesting, but how can we have those silent, those quieter conversations with the fossil fuel companies to listen to their scenarios for transition, and particularly for the just transition, and the faith community needs to articulate more what that just transition means.
I'm just going to pause for a moment and ask if those up here at the table would like to comment on anything that's come up so far in terms of the discussion. Lindsey?
So I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. First, thank you, Chiara, also for the interface statement that Chiara helped put together. Please do talk to her and see it. It was pretty special. Greg, for my suggestion, a fourth would be engagement on our individual transformation. What worries me is how little we engage in the fact that this is caused by human behavior. So much is about, let's just have our cake and eat it too. And that really worries me. And I see it also in the IPCC. It's almost as if we're afraid to go to a place which I think is a healthy transformation. To our colleague on security, we would love to, maybe if you could exchange your cards later. One of the things we actually had a military presence in a quiet diplomacy lunch we had in Geneva. That is an engagement that's really important because in many ways they're the ones who are identifying it. And just, I quoted in the Interfaith an op-ed on this statement. Last year we spent 1.6 trillion on military expenditure worldwide. If we could get the military to see climate change as a priority on investment, shifting that money from guns to renewables, we have a different story. And finally, yes, what do we have? The fragile ecosystems from our Unitarian Universalists. Thank you.
Thanks. I think what's resonating to me when I hear your questions and comments is that in some way we are all called to a new way of living. We are all called, wherever we are, to become ambassadors, if you like, for climate peace and climate justice. So we've got to figure out, what our path is individually and collectively. And I think, for example, from a pulpit, I can preach 1.5. I can preach 100% RE. I can pray for it, but I need to also join together with partners of all kinds around the world, whether they're in the military or whether they're in social groups, indigenous groups, women's groups, and so I wanted to commend to you, if you haven't already seen it, Setting the Path Towards 1.5, a civil society equity report of the pre-2020 ambition. Many, many, many organizations and churches and faith communities have signed on to that report statement. I think we need to be bringing this forward collectively as much as possible and be where the action is.
Henrik?
I just put a thing in my mouth. Sorry, I wasn't really ready to answer, but no, but it feels like we're preaching for the choir here. Everybody's sort of, we were very much resonance of what we are saying. But actually, Chiara brought up something that I think is also important. When how do we act when we actually get sort of different kind of interests is set against each other, especially when it comes to fossil fuels? Let me tell you a short story. We have a Swedish enterprise called Vattenfall that don't have the best reputation in Germany. And they have this lignite coal mine that they were going to sell. And we have a huge discussion to say, don't sell them. Use this as an opportunity to show how you can do the transition from being dependent on the fossils to do this transition over and keep the social responsibility for the workers, because that was the question. There were 6,000 people without work. So we tried from Church of Sweden, together with friends in the evangelical church in Germany, to get them out to write a letter to the Swedish government to say, this is a chance to really do a new way. Just don't sell it to these crooks from the enterprise from Czech Republic who's going to use as much as they can from the coal, and to say, this is the time for transition. Use this opportunity. And the bishops were much more reluctant to answer to this than we say, we want to sign an interface statement on climate change for the world. Okay, I sign. But when it actually comes closer to you, it's much more harder. And that is, I think, as faith communities, to actually come to talk to them in deeper senses. This is not something that you just sign. Now you actually see that this is for real. This is something happening. This has social consequences. How do we act now to act responsible? So I think it might sound that it's so easy and everybody agrees, but when it really comes to playing hardball, or what you call it, then I think it's more important that we as faith communities and have an open space for a discussion to think, where do we go from here? And this is also a part that much of the climate change has been a kind of gloom and doom scenarios that make people afraid. But there is also, this is the Kairos moment when we actually could make a much brighter future. So why not? I mean, that Desmond Tutu has been into climate, also says, like he said when apartheid, come over to the winning side. We have much more fun leaving the fossil. We will have so much fun. It's going to be great. It's going to be so great, to quote elect president. It's going to be so great that when we sort of get over to the fossil free, but we need to, it's created by hope and by prayer, I would say. So that it's actually rather tough business to be a faith communities and be serious on your faith. Thank you.
Valerian.
Thank you. I would like to say a few things. One is regarding the vision. Just transition for me is something essential. And I think this is also what we can see here. What is the vision? How far do we see? How far do we project ourselves? And that's where we really need to learn from our older ancient brothers and sisters from the indigenous phase. They think in terms of 6-7 generations, but we somehow, in the kind of modern culture that we live in, we forgot how to do that. And I think that if we were again starting to look at the future in a creative, possible, joyful, hopeful manner, we might be able to take the right steps with the right kind of decisions. So one of the things we actually advocate for in Geneva is to have a special rapporteur analyzing what's happening with climate change. Because for now, there's not even a human right setup for it. And this is such a pity, because what do we know? What do we have to look at, and how would we find solutions? And then, yes, of course, ecosystems are so, the earth is so sensitive. It is sensitive. And I think the earth is resilient. And I think human beings are far less resilient. The earth will survive. I don't think we all will if we want to go on living the way we do. So what are the changes that we need to make as individuals, but as a humanity? And this isn't something that we are going to be hopefully forced into, because when you're forced into things, you don't like them. But how can we actually, with our hearts, find a way to change our way to be? And about the solidarity and security issue, I find that it's so important to look at solidarity there as a possible solution. And I remember when they had so many climate issues in Chile, how they put all the different things that they had in the house together and they ended up having a gigantic soup that fed the whole community. And that was the idea of the women of the community. So one onion, one carrot, one cabbage, one wouldn't have fed a family, but they managed to feed the whole village. So I think we all have things to give into it, but we're always waiting for governments. And I think the recent election are actually teaching us that. We can't wait for governments any longer. Thank you.
I want to hand back to you all in a moment, but especially since a number of people came in as Sonja was speaking, I would like to ask Sonja in particular just to mention her particular comments about the role of transitional justice. And it fits in with the question of recognizing hurt and recognizing fear in those who have committed wrongs in the past. Sonja, could you give us the brief version?
Sure, and I'll try to add something new so those of you who were here before don't have to listen to it again. As I was listening to everyone's comments and thinking about the name of this side event, it's on trust. And as an American who is so deeply appalled by the election right now, it's actually, I don't actually have words for it, or I might just start to cry. I've been really trying to figure out what trust means. How do I trust my fellow Americans when we just did what we did? And I think that the way I've been working through this is exactly to go to the heart of what it means to create solidarity, to create a new vision. You have to have trust in the people you disagree with most. You have to have trust that they're coming to the table with some concern that's so deep at their heart that you and them don't see things the same way, but there's some element of shared humanity. So when I listen to the people who voted for Donald Trump, who I have decided I will refuse to call president for the duration of whatever it is that he is going to do. One night I lay awake trying to think of all the things I would say to him if I ever saw him. And I decided to take the old tradition of thinking about titles quite seriously, a Quaker tradition actually, thinking about why and how we give titles. And I decided I would not give him a title. Anyway, thinking about trust and what it means to trust someone you disagree with. And I think the heart of transitional justice is this idea that there is a shared conflict. You are both worse off if you leave the conflict as it is. But you both recognize that there's a reason why you're in conflict. There's some deep injustice which has happened. And the only way you can move forward is to create a situation where you can actually hear each other, which includes both hearing profound loss and hearing the fears of those who will lose their privileges, those who feel they will lose some concrete material benefits, those who feel the emotional cost of being called out as being quote unquote guilty. And another, I was thinking of this in the United States as well, as someone who does a lot of work around racial tension. As a white person, we're constantly having to deal with what white privilege is. And it's a very hard thing to work around. And the climate space is exactly the same. Those of us who have benefited from this have to deal with this element of privilege. And it's uncomfortable. And so when we're talking about transitional justice, we're talking about having to find spaces where people from both sides can come to the table with their profound loss and with their fear for their own identity, for their own dignity, and their own ability to respect themselves on the quote unquote perpetrator side. So I just wanted to return that to this kind of core notion of trust and how crucial I think this, and how powerful thinking hard about what trust can be.
Thank you, Sonja. Our friend here has a comment.
Thank you. My name is Dinesh Suna. I work for the Ecumenical Water Network of the World Council of Churches. I just want to have two quick comments. One is recently in the COPs, the kind of presence of the faith communities has really inspired, particularly in COP21, where 1.8 million signatures were handed over to the previous Secretary General, Frederick Christian Figueres. And even in this couple of days ago, Secretary of State Kerry continued to say the faith community continues with having this moral responsibility for care for creation and influencing others. I think these are very important affirmations, and I'm very happy that you're continuing it even further. The second, a person who works on water justice issues, I'm very happy to see the opportunity to link water with climate change has become very evident, because climate change manifests through water. And therefore the adaptation, mitigation, and all the more the human right to water are bringing an important dimensions to the water activists and bringing us closer to address climate change. So I'm very happy that even in this session, you highlighted the importance of protecting water for protecting climate.
Thank you. More contributions, comments, or questions, please? John, oh, and then.
Yes, I thank you for your presentations. Very helpful. There is this sense
John,
of,
could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I should. I'm John Brinkman. I'm a historian of religions for East Asia, and I work in the interreligious environmental dialogue. And that's what I attempt to do. What I actually accomplish is another matter. However, I think that there's something happening at this COP and the sequence of COPs that we've had that makes your type of presentation very, very helpful as part now of a tradition of thought that has gone on. And what do I mean by that? It's in terms of faith, there's that sense of, how would you say, subjective communion that is at the basis of all sense of the sacred. That is an important input to what has to be also called objective analysis. And I think those two things are coming together now. In what sense? I'm very happy that some of the literature has been proposed here. One was the equity report. The other was this very fine climate change and security in South Asia. So that we know that our sense of subjective communion is now part of a tradition of thought within the COP. And I'd like to present to you one other focus that was just published by UNEP. It's called Environment, Religion, and Culture in the context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, just published by UNEP. It's not the proceedings of the Tehran conference. I don't think anyone really reads proceedings. But if you get in touch with UNEP and get a copy of this work, I think it would encourage you in the sense of contributions that you have to make. And might I just, without going too far on, just give you one quote and then an indication of the context. The quote simply states, it seems to me, very well, the influence of what we attempt to bring to this sustainable development dialogue. The deep psychic change needed to withdraw us from the fascination of the industrial world and the deceptive gifts that it gives us is too difficult for simply the avoidance of its difficulties or the attractions of its benefits. Eventually, only our sense of the sacred will save us. And then added to that are agendas that indicate humanity is on the crossroads regarding climate change. And then it indicates the various marvelous statements before COP21 from the Buddhist community, the Hindu community, the Christian community. And so this is a bit of a volume that is part of your tradition of contribution to the COP and to Sustainable Development Goals. So again, it's called Environment, Religion, and Culture in the context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Please.
My name is Craig Atwood. I'm a theologian with the Moravian Church in America, and this is actually my first COP. Very much appreciate this session, particularly looking at this issue as an American. And the election was absolutely devastating to us, me, and others at the Theological Seminary, with this great sense of shock that so many Americans would elect a anti-climate agenda and climate deniers. And I'm struck by the fact that often what we do at this level has great difficulty getting down to ordinary people who are people of faith, and yet somehow don't connect the environment to their faith tradition. So is there, how do we, I know we can preach it, but people leave when we preach it. They don't listen. How, in a practical sense, can we build from a faith tradition to inspire people with this sense of the sacred, and that action is necessary when they don't believe there is a problem to begin with?
That and other interesting questions are still in the room. If anyone would like to say something, please.
Yes, I'm Eva. I'm a student of political science from Brussels. And actually, I have some thoughts. I don't know if it's really a question, but when I look around me, I see so much fear, and it seems like almost everyone has lost their sense of meaning in life. I mean, the youth, there are a lot of youth with a Muslim background who maybe see some solution in extremism, or not really in extremism, but like they don't see another meaning. So maybe that's just the only way they can find a meaning in their life. And then there are a lot of people who are faithless. So they think that religion is something from the past, but then they don't know an answer of how they could give meaning to their life in another way. Then there are a lot of people who are somewhere in the mid-term of their career and they're having a midlife crisis or a burnout, and they also don't know how to find an answer to that. Then you have the rise of the right-wing populism, like in America with Trump now. So it just seems that everyone is so afraid of everything and doesn't know an answer. And I'm wondering, how did we arrive at this point, and how to give an answer to these people? And I mean, it just seems that religion somehow cannot reach these people anymore. So, yeah.
We have time for one more contribution. Yes, our friend there, please.
Saigo, my name is William David. I'm with the Assembly of First Nations. Actually, it's not so much related to the previous question, but the previous question made me think about this. And it's the same fundamental question is what can you do about it? And I don't have a clean answer, but in my case, I'm thinking about essentialism, and particularly for Indigenous peoples. So I don't know if this is being recorded, and I won't get into specifics, but oftentimes we talk about Indigenous peoples being so impacted, and there's so many examples of ceremonies which are very, very time dependent on very specific environmental conditions that are under change. And like, it's changing, right? So I know in my own community, that's certainly the case with something that occurs in the spring that's just not happening the way that it ought to. And it comes to a point where it's actually dangerous for people that are attempting to practice that particular ceremony. So no matter what, we're changing. And Indigenous cultures in general, where I'm from, are subject to all kinds of change. And there's very powerful legal incentives, at least in the country I'm from, to maintain essentialism, right? Because if you change too much, then you're out of pace and you're no longer considered Indigenous, you're no longer able to practice your ceremonies, your traditions, your cultures. And it's a very, very, I should say, difficult question to grapple with in terms of modernization generally, but climate change really forces that discussion both from the adaptation side and also from the mitigation side, as more and more people who engage in harvesting activities, for instance, where I'm from, fishing, are heavily reliant on essentially fossil fuels to engage in that activity these days. It's a very, very difficult question for us to grapple with. And I mean, I wish I had some kind of answer or something more to contribute, but really all I have is the question is what to do with that. And I mean, I think about extremism as well, just because it's so rigid. But like these overly essentialized rigid notions, which really do have a root in law, at least in my country, very much traipse into and can very cleanly interfere with essentially climate change mitigation adaptation. And to get to the point of conflict, it creates not only conflict within a people or within a nation state, but also within a community, a family, and even at the individual level as you grapple with identity issues. I just throw that out there. I mean, I really don't have any specific question other than what do you do about it?
Thank you very much. It's very profound. Friends, what we plan to do now, for those who would like to stay, is for about 5 minutes to ask Valeriane to lead us in a guided meditation, just to connect and to recognize what's being contributed here by you all. It's optional, of course, but we hope you'd like to stay. Could I just take from what's been said a few ideas that resonate, that I hope also work for you? Starting with what our friend has just said, and was said earlier by John, quoting, "Only our sense of the sacred will save us." I think that's something that even those who don't identify with a particular formal spiritual path, a religion, might find something that resonates there. We have to trust in those we disagree with most. That sounds quite profound. And moving throughout a lot of what has been said, and it seems very trite at one way, but I think it's worth saying, there has, in what many people have said, despite everything, been this feeling of hope that there are challenges here at the personal level, at the society level, and out of that something new can come, or in more conventional terms to say that out of great challenges come great opportunities. And I hope that's something we can all work with together from our different backgrounds. Valeriane, would you like to lead us, please? And I shall attempt to put up.
I would invite you to put your 2 feet on the floor and allow your bodies to just relax. Many of us are very tired, so you deserve a bit of rest for your body as well as your soul, spirit. And in this moment, I allow myself to go within. I allow myself to, of the gigantic, come genealogy within the space of my inner being, the sacred inner space. Where I can get in touch with the deepest essence of my being, the soul, the spirit, the heart, love, peace, courage, and beauty are there within me, within each one of us. And the ripple effect of my getting in touch and experiencing my own inner power, my own inner beauty, allows me to share that energy, that light. It spreads to the heart of those who have questions and doubts. It cools my own mind, my fears. I find a space within where all fear is gone, all darkness is gone, and only light, love, and beauty prevails. And I look at nature, the earth, our brothers and sisters on this earth. And I know we all resonate. That spirit, divinity, is at the heart of each one. And as an individual, the more I learn the art of coming back within the space, the more I can open up to the source of peace, of justice, of love. God is love. And the being that I am has the inner power to come back to love and peace. And look at my brothers and sisters with that trust that they also have that power, with the hope that they also wake up to their inner values, and that together we create again the tapestry of love. My inner thoughts, my inner feelings, my vision, my awareness are my inner wealth. And each time I go within, I re-energize myself. I re-encounter my heart and find courage and power, vision and love. Thank you very much. Om Shanti.
We believe we may be moving over to the photo, but we're delighted to have anyone come up and speak more, perhaps as we move over there. We're not quite sure where. I think it's outside, is it? Thank you all very much indeed.
For those of you who don't know about the photo, Ken is organizing the large family photo for anyone at the COP who wants to show their commitment. It's just out near the exit, I believe, and it was supposed to start like 5 minutes ago. So if you want to be part of that, you might want to walk slightly quickly.
Have you worked with the concept of ecological debt?
It's one of our concepts for sure. Because you have to engage with what is this conversation harm? And one of the things that we're so I'm actually in the middle of writing a book with a colleague of mine who does transitional justice in South Africa. And one of the key elements is trying to articulate the diverse nature of the harms. So that is one of several different forms of harm. Yeah. Yeah,
so that was the question.
So
I
that kind
just
of,
wanted
yeah,
to
there's
pose.
there's a whole variety of harms, and that's definitely one of them. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah, we'll
Yeah, and
check the
other audience,
website
please
and
check
see.
my website out, or if you have thoughts and comments. Yeah, do get a hold of me, and I can send you all the documents.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
I am for this picture. I decided I'm going to try to do this, so I'm going to mosey out of here.